Margaret Holloway adjusted her pearl necklace one last time before stepping out of her modest two-story home on Maple Street. The autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and the distant sound of church bells calling the faithful to worship. At 73, Margaret had walked this same route to St. Andrew's Methodist Church every Sunday for the past 42 years. Her worn leather purse hung from her left arm, and clutched in her right hand was her treasured hymnal, a burgundy-bound book with gold lettering, its pages soft from decades of use. The neighbors who saw her that morning would later tell police she looked exactly as she always did. Navy blue dress, sensible shoes, silver hair pinned back in a neat bun. Mrs. Chen from across the street waved from her garden, her arthritis-gnarled hands still capable of tending to her prize-winning roses. Margaret waved back, her wedding ring catching the morning sunlight like a small beacon of the life she'd built and maintained for 7 decades. She never made it to church. The walk from Margaret's house to St. Andrew's was a journey she could have made blindfolded. Past the Hendersons' rose garden where she'd stopped countless times to admire the blooms and exchange pleasantries about the weather. Past the old oak tree where she'd carved her initials with Robert in 1967, back when they were young and believed love could conquer anything. Past the corner market where she bought her weekly groceries, always on Thursday mornings, always with exact change counted out before she reached the register. By 10:30 a.m., when the opening hymn began without her familiar alto voice in the third pew, Margaret Holloway had vanished without a trace. Her absence was immediately noticeable, not just because she'd never missed a service in 4 decades, but because her voice had been a cornerstone of the church choir, a steady, reliable presence that other voices unconsciously followed. The congregation's harmony felt off balance without her, like a symphony missing its first violin. Pastor Williams paused during the opening prayer, his eyes scanning the sanctuary with growing concern. Margaret's pew, third from the front on the right side, remained conspicuously empty. Her usual spot by the aisle, where she could easily rise for communion and help elderly parishioners navigate the steps, looked wrong somehow, like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. Eleanor Vasquez, Margaret's closest friend and fellow volunteer, kept glancing toward the empty pew throughout the service. They'd planned to work together in the church garden after worship, preparing the flower beds for winter. Eleanor had brought extra gardening gloves, knowing Margaret always forgot hers. The gloves sat unused in Eleanor's purse, a small detail that would later take on enormous significance. The hymnal Margaret carried that morning was more than just a book of songs. It was a repository of memories, its margins filled with her careful handwriting documenting the moments when certain hymns had touched her life. Robert's favorite, she'd written in fading blue ink next to "How Great Thou Art," sang at Sarah's wedding, appeared beside "Joyful, Joyful We Adore Thee" in the green ink she'd favored in the 1980s. First song after Robert's funeral was penciled next to "Amazing Grace" in handwriting that trembled with grief. That hymnal would surface 14 years later at a funeral, setting off a chain of revelations that would shatter everything her family thought they knew about the woman they'd mourned for over a decade. But on that crisp October morning in 2009, it was simply the book Margaret Holloway carried to church, just as she had every Sunday for 42 years, until the day she didn't arrive at all. Margaret Holloway was the kind of woman small towns are built around, steady, reliable, woven into the fabric of community life so thoroughly that her absence would leave visible holes. Born Margaret Elizabeth Turner in 1936, she'd never lived anywhere but Millbrook, watching the town evolve from a farming community to a bedroom suburb while remaining fundamentally unchanged herself. She'd married Robert Holloway in 1968, a quiet ceremony at St. Andrew's Methodist Church that set the pattern for their life together. Robert worked at the lumber mill. Margaret taught 3rd grade at Millbrook Elementary. They'd planned for children immediately, but it took 8 years and 3 miscarriages before Sarah arrived, followed by David 2 years later, then Michael after another 3-year gap. Each pregnancy was approached with cautious hope, each child treasured as the miracle Margaret had begun to think would never happen. After Robert's death from pancreatic cancer in 2003, Margaret had thrown herself into church activities with renewed devotion, as if faith could fill the Robert-shaped hole in her heart. She volunteered at the food bank every Wednesday, sorting donations with the same meticulous care she'd once used to organize her classroom supplies. She hosted the church book club every Friday evening, leading discussions with the gentle authority of someone who'd spent 30 years helping children discover the magic of stories. Her routine was clockwork precise, a structure that had sustained her through grief and given meaning to her widowhood. Every Sunday, 6:30 a.m. wake-up, 7 a.m. coffee and toast while reading the church bulletin, 8 a.m. shower and careful selection of appropriate attire, 8:30 a.m. breakfast of oatmeal with brown sugar and sliced banana, 9 a.m. final preparations including the ritual of checking her purse for tissues, breath mints, and the small notebook where she jotted down prayer requests. 9:17 a.m. departure for the 20-minute walk to church. She preferred walking, even when her daughter Sarah offered rides, even when her knees began to protest the distance. "The fresh air clears my mind for worship," she'd say, patting Sarah's hand with maternal affection. "Besides, I see things when I walk that I'd miss in a car. Mrs. Patterson's new garden gnome, the progress on the Johnsons' roof repair, whether old Mr. Kowalski remembered to bring in his newspaper." Margaret lived alone in the house she'd shared with Robert for 35 years, but she was never lonely. Her refrigerator was covered with graduation photos, wedding invitations, and birth announcements, a testament to the lives she'd touched during her 3 decades of teaching. Former students, now adults with children of their own, still sent her Christmas cards and updates on their lives. She kept every card, filing them in shoeboxes organized by year, creating an archive of the community's growth and change. The hymnal had been a wedding gift from Robert's mother, a woman who'd initially disapproved of her son marrying a town girl instead of someone from their farming family. But Margaret had won her over with patience and genuine kindness, and the hymnal became a symbol of acceptance, passed down with love and the hope that it would guide the young couple's spiritual journey together. Margaret knew every song by heart. She'd been singing them for over 40 years, but she carried the hymnal anyway, running her fingers along the familiar pages during services, sometimes pausing to reread her own annotations. It was more than a book. It was a connection to her late husband, to her faith, to the woman she'd been for 7 decades. The weight of it in her hands was comforting, substantial, real in a way that made her feel anchored to something larger than herself. That Saturday evening before her disappearance, she'd seemed particularly cheerful when Sarah called to confirm their usual Sunday lunch plans. "I'm making your favorite pot roast," Margaret had said, her voice bright with anticipation. "And I found that old photo album you wanted to see, the one with pictures from your father's college days. You won't believe how young he looked in his fraternity photos." Nothing in that conversation, or in Margaret's behavior in the weeks leading up to that Sunday, suggested this would be her last conversation with her daughter. She'd been planning ahead, making appointments for the following week, discussing Christmas plans even though it was only October. She'd ordered bulbs for spring planting and had asked Sarah to help her move some furniture the following weekend. Margaret Holloway was a woman firmly rooted in life, in routine, in the small but meaningful connections that made up her world. Her disappearance would be so completely out of character that those who knew her best would struggle to accept it had really happened. The route to St. Andrews was Margaret's sacred path, unchanged for decades despite the town's gradual modernization around it. She'd exit her front door, pause to check that it was properly locked, then turn left on Maple Street. The first block took her past the Hendersons' rose garden, where she'd often stop to exchange pleasantries about the weather or admire particularly spectacular blooms. Mrs. Henderson had been battling breast cancer that fall, and Margaret always made a point of asking about her treatment, offering quiet words of encouragement and promises of prayer. The second block brought her to the corner of Maple and Elm, where the old oak tree stood like a sentinel. She and Robert had carved their initials there in 1967, back when they were courting, and such gestures seemed romantically daring rather than mildly vandalistic. The tree had grown around their carving over the decades, the letters now stretched and distorted but still visible if you knew where to look. Margaret always slowed her pace here, sometimes reaching out to touch the bark, a private moment of communion with her past. The third and fourth blocks were residential, lined with modest homes where Margaret knew every family. She'd taught many of the children, attended their graduations, celebrated their marriages, mourned their losses. Walking this route was like moving through a living scrapbook of her life's work, each house holding memories of the people she'd helped shape, and who had, in turn, shaped her. That morning, multiple witnesses placed her along this familiar route, each interaction so normal, so typical of Margaret's Sunday routine, that they became precious in retrospect. The last glimpses of a woman who was about to vanish from the world as completely as if she'd never existed. Mrs. Chen saw her leave at exactly 9:17 a.m., waving from her garden where she was deadheading the last of the season's roses. Margaret had called out a compliment about the flowers, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. Mrs. Chen would later remember thinking how elegant Margaret looked that morning, her posture straight despite her 73 years, her step confident and purposeful. Tom Bradley, walking his golden retriever Max, encountered Margaret at the corner of Maple and Elm at approximately 9:22 a.m. Tom was a retired postal worker who'd known Margaret for 20 years, and their brief exchange followed the comfortable pattern of long acquaintance. He'd tipped his hat, she'd smiled and commented on what a beautiful morning it was for worship, how the autumn colors seemed particularly vibrant this year. Max had wagged his tail in recognition. Margaret always carried dog treats in her purse, though she'd never owned a pet herself. She seemed happy, Tom would later tell investigators. Not just content, but genuinely happy, like she was looking forward to something special. The last confirmed sighting came from 16-year-old Jessica Martinez, who was walking to her part-time job at the corner market. Jessica saw Margaret at 9:28 a.m., about 3 blocks from the church, still walking at her usual measured pace. The teenager had been running late and moving quickly, but she'd noticed Margaret because of her distinctive posture and the way she carried herself with such dignity. She was humming, Jessica would later tell investigators, this detail emerging only after repeated interviews. I could hear it as she passed. It sounded like a hymn, but I couldn't place which one. My grandmother hums the same way when she's really happy about something. Jessica remembered thinking Mrs. Holloway looked particularly elegant that morning, her navy blue dress perfectly pressed, her silver hair catching the sunlight. There was something almost festive about her appearance, as if she were dressed for a special occasion rather than just regular Sunday service. After that sighting at 9:28 a.m., Margaret Holloway simply ceased to exist in any verifiable way. She had 2 more blocks to walk, approximately 6 minutes at her usual pace before reaching St. Andrew's Methodist Church. Those 6 minutes became a void that would swallow her completely, leaving behind only questions and the growing certainty that something terrible had happened to a woman who'd never hurt anyone in her 73 years of life. The church service began at 10:04 a.m. sharp, as it had every Sunday for over a century. By 10:15, when Margaret's usual pew remained empty and her voice was absent from the opening hymn, fellow parishioners began to exchange worried glances. Margaret had never missed a service without calling ahead, never failed to appear in her customary spot in the third pew. Pastor Williams, a man who'd known Margaret for 15 years and had officiated at Robert's funeral, felt a growing unease as he led the congregation through the familiar rituals. Something was wrong. Margaret Holloway was as reliable as sunrise, as constant as the church bells that called the faithful to worship. Her absence was like a discordant note in a familiar symphony, impossible to ignore and deeply unsettling. Sarah Holloway Chen felt the first flutter of real panic as she drove toward her mother's house, her hands gripping the steering wheel with unnecessary force. At 45, Sarah was a nurse practitioner who'd inherited her mother's practical nature and her father's analytical mind. She'd trained herself to remain calm in medical emergencies, to think clearly when others panicked. But this was different. This was her mother, and Margaret Holloway simply didn't deviate from routine without explanation. The call from Eleanor Vasquez had come at 10:45 a.m., just as Sarah was settling down with her Sunday crossword puzzle and a second cup of coffee. "Your mother isn't at church," Eleanor had said, her voice tight with worry that immediately transmitted itself through the phone line. "That's not like her at all. Pastor Williams asked if anyone had seen her, and nobody has. We're all very concerned." Sarah had tried to maintain her professional composure, suggesting logical explanations even as her stomach began to knot with anxiety. Maybe Margaret had felt unwell and decided to stay home. Maybe she'd had a minor accident. A fall, perhaps. and was waiting for help. Maybe she'd simply overslept, though Margaret hadn't overslept in decades and always set 2 alarm clocks as backup. But Margaret's house told a different story entirely. Sarah used her key to enter through the front door, calling out, "Mom?" in a voice that echoed through rooms that felt somehow too quiet, too still. The house was immaculate as always. Margaret maintained it with the same precision she'd once used to organize her classroom. Every surface was dust-free, every item in its designated place, every detail reflecting the ordered mind of a woman who found comfort in routine and structure. In the kitchen, breakfast dishes had been washed and put away with Margaret's characteristic thoroughness. The dish towel hung perfectly straight on its hook. The coffee maker had been cleaned and unplugged. Even the sugar bowl had been wiped clean and returned to its exact position in the cabinet. This wasn't the kitchen of someone who'd left in a hurry or confusion. Upstairs, Margaret's bedroom revealed the same meticulous preparation. The bed was made with military precision, corners tucked with the expertise of someone who'd been making beds the same way for 50 years. Margaret's everyday clothes, a comfortable sweater and slacks she'd worn Saturday, were folded neatly in the laundry basket. Her Sunday outfit had obviously been selected and worn. The navy blue dress was missing from its usual place in the closet, along with the matching shoes and the small pearl earrings that had been Robert's gift on their 10th anniversary. Sarah's trained eye cataloged these details automatically, building a picture of her mother's final morning at home. Margaret had followed her routine exactly, preparing for church with the same care she'd shown for 42 years. This wasn't a woman experiencing confusion or distress. This was a woman getting ready for a normal Sunday, anticipating nothing more unusual than worship service, followed by lunch with her daughter. Margaret's everyday purse sat on the kitchen counter where she always left it. But her Sunday purse, a small black leather bag that matched her church shoes, was gone. Sarah opened the everyday purse with trembling fingers, finding Margaret's driver's license, credit cards, and the small address book where she kept important phone numbers written in her careful script. Her house keys were there too, which meant Margaret had taken her spare set. Sarah called the police at 11:30 a.m., her voice steady despite the growing certainty that something was terribly wrong. Officer Janet Rodriguez arrived within minutes, her patrol car pulling into Margaret's driveway with the quiet efficiency of small-town law enforcement. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran who'd known Margaret casually through community events, and her expression shifted from routine concern to genuine worry. As Sarah described her mother's unwavering habits and the impossibility of her simply not showing up. "Has she seemed confused lately? Any signs of memory problems?" Officer Rodriguez asked gently, her notebook ready to record details that might explain a straightforward case of an elderly person becoming disoriented. "None," Sarah insisted, her voice gaining strength from certainty. "She's sharp as ever. She balances her checkbook to the penny every month, remembers everyone's birthdays without writing them down, can recite poetry she learned in high school word for word. She helps other people remember things. Just last week, she reminded Mrs. Patterson about a doctor's appointment Mrs. Patterson had forgotten." Rodriguez walked through the house with Sarah, noting the same details that had struck Margaret's daughter: the perfect order, the evidence of normal preparation for a normal day, the complete absence of anything suggesting confusion, distress, or hasty departure. This wasn't the scene of someone who'd wandered off in a state of mental confusion. This was the home of someone who'd left with purpose and intention, expecting to return. By 2 p.m., a search was underway. Volunteers from St. Andrew's Methodist Church joined police officers in combing the route between Margaret's house and the church, their voices calling her name echoing through the quiet Sunday afternoon. They searched every yard, every alley, every possible place where an elderly woman might have fallen or sought shelter. They found nothing. No signs of struggle, no dropped belongings, no indication of where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. Margaret's son David drove down from Portland that evening, his face grim with worry, and the exhaustion of a 4-hour drive spent imagining worst-case scenarios. Her youngest, Michael, flew in from Denver the next morning, taking emergency leave from his job as a software engineer. The 3 siblings sat in their childhood kitchen, staring at the pot roast their mother had prepared for Sunday lunch, now cold and untouched in the refrigerator, a meal that had been made with love and anticipation, now serving as evidence of interrupted plans and shattered routine. She was excited about something, Sarah remembered suddenly, the memory surfacing as they sat in the familiar kitchen surrounded by the artifacts of their mother's careful life. When I called Saturday night to confirm lunch, she seemed, I don't know, almost giddy, like she had a secret she was looking forward to sharing. Detective Ray Morrison had worked missing persons cases for 15 years, long enough to recognize patterns and develop instincts about which cases would resolve quickly and which would haunt him for months or years. Margaret Holloway's disappearance defied every pattern he knew, presenting a puzzle that seemed to violate the basic laws of how people vanished from their lives. Morrison was a methodical investigator who'd grown up in Millbrook himself, though he was young enough that Margaret had never been his teacher. He knew the town's rhythms, understood how information flowed through its networks of family and friendship, and recognized that Margaret Holloway's disappearance was fundamentally different from the usual missing person cases that crossed his desk. Most people who disappeared had reasons: financial troubles, relationship problems, mental health issues, substance abuse, or simply the desire to escape from lives that had become unbearable. Margaret had none of these factors. Her bank account showed regular, predictable transactions: grocery shopping on Thursdays, utility payments on the first of each month, modest donations to the church and various charities. There were no large withdrawals, no unusual purchases, no evidence of financial stress or secret expenditures. Her medical records, obtained with the family's permission, indicated good health for her age. She took medication for mild arthritis and high blood pressure, both conditions well controlled and neither affecting her mental clarity. Her last physical exam, just 6 months earlier, had found her in excellent condition for a 73-year-old woman. Dr. Patterson, who'd been her physician for 20 years, described her as one of his most compliant patients, someone who followed medical advice precisely and never missed appointments. The investigation expanded beyond the walking route to encompass Margaret's entire life. Morrison and his team interviewed everyone Margaret knew: church members, former colleagues from her teaching days, neighbors, shopkeepers, the postal worker who delivered her mail, the teenager who mowed her lawn in summer. The picture that emerged was of a woman so consistent, so reliable, that her absence felt like a fundamental law of nature had been broken. Eleanor Vasquez, Margaret's closest friend, provided the most detailed picture of Margaret's state of mind in the weeks before her disappearance. They'd spoken by phone almost daily and worked together on church projects twice a week. Eleanor insisted that Margaret had seemed completely normal, perhaps even happier than usual. She'd been excited about the upcoming holidays, making plans for Christmas decorations and discussing recipes for the church's annual bake sale. She was looking forward to things, Eleanor told Morrison, her elderly hands twisting a tissue as she struggled to make sense of her friend's disappearance. She'd ordered bulbs for spring planting, daffodils and tulips. She was planning to redecorate her guest room so the grandchildren would be more comfortable when they visited. These aren't the actions of someone planning to disappear. Security cameras were scarce in Millbrook's quiet residential areas, but Morrison's team found footage from the corner market showing Margaret walking past at 9:28 a.m., just as Jessica Martinez had reported. The timestamp confirmed the witness accounts, and the image showed Margaret moving at her normal pace, appearing calm and purposeful. She looked directly ahead, not glancing around nervously or showing any signs of distress. After that frame of grainy security footage, the trail went completely cold. Morrison expanded the search radius, bringing in dogs trained to track human scent. The dogs followed Margaret's trail from her house along her usual route, but lost the scent at approximately the same location where she'd last been seen. It was as if she'd simply evaporated from the sidewalk, leaving no trace of where she'd gone or how she'd gotten there. Theories emerged and were systematically investigated and discarded. Had she suffered a sudden medical emergency and wandered into the woods in confusion? Search teams combed every acre of forest within a 5-mile radius, finding nothing. Had she been the victim of a random crime? There was no evidence of violence, no witnesses to any disturbance, no reports of suspicious vehicles or strangers in the area. Had she chosen to disappear voluntarily? Her family vehemently rejected this possibility, and her financial records showed no preparation for such a plan. No withdrawn cash, no closed accounts, no research into new identities or distant locations. The possibility of foul play couldn't be dismissed, but it seemed almost as unlikely as voluntary disappearance. Margaret had no enemies, no one who might wish her harm. She'd lived a quiet life focused on family, faith, and community service. She had no valuable possessions that might attract thieves, no secrets that might make her a target for blackmail, no involvement in anything that might bring her into contact with dangerous people. As weeks turned to months, Morrison found himself returning again and again to the basic impossibility of the case. Margaret Holloway had been seen by multiple witnesses walking toward church on a quiet Sunday morning in a small town where everyone knew everyone else. She'd simply vanished between one block and the next, leaving no trace, no clues, no explanation for how a 73-year-old woman could disappear so completely from such a public place. The case remained active, but leads dwindled to nothing. Margaret's children took turns staying in her house, hoping against hope that she'd simply walk through the front door with a reasonable explanation for her absence. The house began to feel like a shrine, everything preserved exactly as she'd left it, waiting for a return that seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing day. Morrison knew that most missing person cases were solved within the first 48 hours, if they were solved at all. After the first month, the chances of finding Margaret alive dropped dramatically. After 6 months, he was essentially investigating a presumed homicide. Though without a body or any evidence of violence, even that classification felt uncertain. The first anniversary of her disappearance brought renewed media attention and a fresh wave of tips from people who thought they'd seen Margaret in distant cities, but none led anywhere. Morrison followed every lead personally, driving hundreds of miles to interview witnesses who'd seen elderly women who resembled Margaret. But none of the sightings proved credible. By the second anniversary, Margaret Holloway's case had gone cold, filed away with the other unsolved mysteries that haunted Morrison's career. He retired in 2014, passing the file to Detective Lisa Park with a heavy heart and a warning that would prove prophetic. This one will haunt you. Good people don't just disappear, but sometimes they do. And we never find out why. Time moved differently in the Holloway house after Margaret's disappearance, as if her absence had somehow altered the fundamental physics of the place. Sarah visited weekly, her key turning in the lock with the same soft click it had made for decades. But the sound echoed differently now in rooms that felt perpetually expectant, as if the house itself was waiting for Margaret to return and restore the natural order of things. Sarah had become the unofficial guardian of her mother's memory and possessions, dusting furniture that never got dirty, watering plants that somehow kept growing despite their owner's absence. The African violets on the kitchen windowsill continued to bloom in their precise rotation, purple flowers giving way to white ones in the same pattern Margaret had maintained for years. Sarah found herself talking to the plants as her mother had done, feeling slightly foolish but unable to break the habit that seemed to keep some part of Margaret alive. The family couldn't bring themselves to sell the house or pack away Margaret's belongings. It felt too much like giving up, like admitting that she was never coming home. Her clothes remained in the closet, organized by season and color in the system Margaret had developed over decades. Her books stayed on their shelves, bookmarks still marking her place in the 3 novels she'd been reading simultaneously. Her reading glasses lay folded on the kitchen table next to a crossword puzzle that would never be completed. David returned to Portland but called every Sunday at exactly 9:17 a.m., the time Margaret would have been leaving for church. The ritual had started unconsciously, but it became a sacred observance, a way of honoring his mother's memory and maintaining connection across the miles. Sometimes Sarah would be at the house when he called, and they'd talk about ordinary things, the weather, work, their children's activities, carefully avoiding the subject that had brought them together in grief. Michael threw himself into his work in Denver, but sent flowers to St. Andrew's Methodist Church every year on the anniversary of Margaret's disappearance. The arrangements were always simple: white lilies or yellow roses, flowers Margaret had loved, accompanied by cards that simply read, "In memory of Margaret Holloway, who loved this place." Pastor Williams, and later his successor, always placed the flowers on the altar during Sunday service, a gesture that kept Margaret's memory alive in the community that had known and loved her. Sarah continued to pay the utilities and property taxes, maintaining the house like a museum of interrupted life. The electricity bill arrived monthly, documenting the minimal power usage of a home where lights were turned on only during weekly visits. The water bill reflected the small amounts used to keep Margaret's plants alive and occasionally run the faucets to prevent the pipes from freezing. These mundane expenses became a form of hope, a way of keeping the house ready for Margaret's return. The community slowly healed around the wound of Margaret's absence, though the scar remained visible to those who'd known her. New families moved to Maple Street, drawn by the quiet neighborhood and reasonable property values. They learned about the woman who'd disappeared from neighbors who still spoke of her in present tense, as if she might return at any moment. Children who'd never known Margaret played in yards where she'd once stopped to admire gardens and chat with their predecessors. Pastor Williams retired in 2016, his farewell sermon including a tribute to the missing parishioner who'd been such a cornerstone of the congregation. His replacement, Pastor Jennifer Martinez, was a young woman who knew Margaret only through the stories parishioners told. But she quickly learned to recognize the special reverence with which the congregation spoke of the woman who'd vanished on her way to worship. The third pew at St. Andrew's remained unofficially reserved for several years, but eventually, new members began sitting there. The church had grown, and space was at a premium during popular services. But longtime members still thought of it as Margaret's pew, and newcomers were gently guided to understand the significance of the spot where a faithful woman had worshipped for 4 decades before disappearing into mystery. Detective Morrison retired in 2014, his farewell party attended by dozens of colleagues and community members whose lives he'd touched during his career. Margaret Holloway's case was mentioned in several speeches, acknowledged as the investigation that had challenged him most deeply. He passed her file to Detective Lisa Park with a mixture of relief and regret, grateful to be free of the burden but sorry to leave the mystery unsolved. Detective Park inherited not just the case file, but the weight of community expectation. Millbrook was the kind of town where people remembered, where Margaret's disappearance remained a topic of conversation at coffee shops and church socials. Park reviewed the file thoroughly, looking for angles Morrison might have missed, but found the investigation had been thorough and professional. There simply weren't any leads left to follow. By 2020, Margaret Holloway had become local legend, the woman who vanished on her way to church, the mystery that proved even small towns could harbor secrets. True crime podcasters occasionally featured her case, drawn by the inexplicable nature of her disappearance and the complete absence of resolution. But without new evidence or witnesses, interest inevitably waned. The case became a cautionary tale about how completely someone could vanish, even in a place where everyone knew everyone else. Margaret's children, now in their 50s, had learned to live with the uncertainty, though it never stopped hurting. They'd created new traditions around her memory. Family gatherings on her birthday, annual donations to the church in her name, the preservation of her house as a tangible link to the woman they'd lost. The grief had evolved from sharp pain to dull ache, but it remained constant, a background presence in their lives like tinnitus of the heart. Sarah had started attending St. Andrew's herself, sitting in her mother's pew and singing the hymns Margaret had loved. Sometimes during particularly moving services, she could almost hear her mother's alto voice joining the congregation, and for a moment, the world felt right again. These moments of imagined connection were both comforting and heartbreaking, reminders of what had been lost and what could never be recovered. The house on Maple Street stood as a monument to interrupted life, its rooms frozen in time like a museum exhibit. Margaret's coffee cup still sat in the dish drainer where she'd left it that final Sunday morning. Her bookmark still marked page 127 of the mystery novel she'd been enjoying. Her calendar still showed appointments for the week she'd never lived to see. Then came the phone call that changed everything. October 15th, 2023. 14 years, 1 month, and 3 days after Margaret Holloway walked out her front door for the last time, carrying her burgundy hymnal, and expecting nothing more eventful than Sunday worship followed by pot roast with her daughter. Eleanor Vasquez had passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 87, her death marking the end of an era for St. Andrew's Methodist Church. Eleanor had been Margaret's closest friend, her partner in countless church projects, the woman who'd first noticed Margaret's absence that fateful Sunday morning. Her death felt like the closing of a chapter that had remained painfully open for 14 years. The loss of the last person who'd truly known Margaret in the fullness of their friendship. Eleanor's funeral drew a large crowd to St. Andrew's, filling the sanctuary with people who'd known her as a volunteer, a neighbor, a friend, a woman whose apple pies had become legendary at church potlucks, and whose gentle wisdom had guided countless community projects. The service was a celebration of a life well lived, but for those who remembered, it was also a reminder of another funeral that had never taken place, another woman whose life had ended without ceremony or closure. Sarah attended the service with mixed emotions, grief for Eleanor's death intertwined with the persistent ache of her mother's unresolved disappearance. She sat in what had once been her mother's pew, now occupied by the Martinez family, but still carrying the weight of memory for those who remembered. The familiar hymns brought tears to her eyes, not just for Eleanor but for Margaret, whose voice had once joined these same songs in this same sacred space. As the congregation rose for the final hymn, Amazing Grace, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold and her hands begin to tremble. The woman in front of her, a middle-aged stranger who'd introduced herself as Eleanor's great niece, visiting from out of state, was holding a burgundy hymnal with gold lettering, the exact same style as her mother's, but that wasn't what stopped Sarah's heart and made her grip the pew back for support. It was the handwriting in the margins. Margaret had always annotated her hymnal, writing little notes about when certain songs had special meaning, creating a personal history of faith and memory within the pages of worship music. Robert's favorite, she'd written in fading blue ink next to How Great Thou Art, the notation dating back to their early marriage, when Robert's bass voice had filled their small apartment during his enthusiastic but off-key singing. Sang at Sarah's wedding, appeared beside Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, in the green ink Margaret had favored in the 1980s, a reminder of the joy that had filled the church on that perfect June day in 1987. Sarah's hands shook as she leaned forward, trying to get a better look without appearing to spy on a fellow mourner. There, in her mother's unmistakable handwriting, were the familiar annotations she'd seen countless times during childhood, when she'd shared the hymnal with Margaret during services. But there were new ones too, notes in the same handwriting, but in different ink, as if they'd been added years later, long after Margaret had disappeared. Eleanor's favorite, she hummed this while gardening, was written in black ink next to Blessed Assurance, the handwriting unmistakably Margaret's but clearly more recent than the faded blue and green annotations Sarah remembered from childhood. Sang together on quiet evenings, appeared beside In the Garden, in what looked like pencil, the letters slightly shakier but still recognizably her mother's careful script. Sarah's vision blurred as the implications crashed over her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a similar hymnal. This was her mother's hymnal, the one Margaret had carried that final Sunday morning, the one that had vanished with her into whatever fate had claimed her. But the new annotation suggested something impossible, something that challenged everything Sarah had believed about her mother's disappearance. The service continued around her, but Sarah heard nothing except the thundering of her own heartbeat. Pastor Martinez's eulogy for Eleanor became background noise as Sarah stared at the hymnal, trying to process what she was seeing. The woman holding it seemed oblivious to Sarah's scrutiny, following along with the service in the natural way of someone who'd used the book many times before. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the crisp October afternoon, Sarah approached the woman with legs that felt unsteady and a voice that threatened to crack. "Excuse me," she said, her words barely audible above the murmur of departing mourners. "That hymnal, where did you get it?" The woman, who introduced herself as Patricia Vasquez Chen, looked surprised by the question, her eyebrows rising in polite confusion. "This old thing?" she said, holding up the burgundy book with casual familiarity. "It was in Aunt Eleanor's bedroom when we were going through her things. She said I could take it as a keepsake, something to remember her by. It's been in her house for years, from what I understand. Why do you ask?" Sarah felt the world tilt around her, reality shifting in ways that made her question everything she thought she knew. "That hymnal belonged to my mother," she said, her voice gaining strength from the certainty of recognition. "She disappeared 14 years ago carrying that exact book. I'd know it anywhere. I can see her handwriting in the margins." Patricia's face went white, the color draining from her cheeks as the implications of Sarah's words sank in. "That's impossible," she whispered, clutching the hymnal protectively against her chest. "Aunt Eleanor said she'd had this for years. She said it was a gift from an old friend who'd moved away. She used it every Sunday when she couldn't make it to church." "Your Aunt Eleanor was my mother's best friend," Sarah said, her mind racing to connect dots that seemed to form an impossible picture. They volunteered together, worked in the church garden together, talked on the phone almost every day. If Eleanor had this hymnal, if she'd had it for years. The sentence hung unfinished between them, heavy with implications neither woman wanted to voice. Around them, other mourners continued their conversations about Eleanor's life and legacy, unaware that a 14-year-old mystery was unraveling in their midst. Patricia's hands trembled as she opened the hymnal, seeing the annotations with new eyes. "These notes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Aunt Eleanor always said they were from a dear friend who'd shared the book with her. She'd read them sometimes and smile, like they brought back happy memories." Sarah reached out tentatively, and Patricia allowed her to take the hymnal, to hold the book that had been such a constant presence in her childhood. The weight of it was exactly as she remembered. The texture of the worn leather cover familiar under her fingertips, but it was the handwriting that confirmed beyond any doubt that this was Margaret's hymnal, the one she'd carried faithfully for 42 years. "Look at this," Sarah said, pointing to a notation beside "How great thou art." "This is my father's name, Robert. My mother wrote this when they were first married. And here," she turned to another page, "this mentions my wedding. These are my mother's memories written in her own hand." Patricia stared at the evidence, her face reflecting the confusion and growing horror of someone whose understanding of reality was being systematically dismantled. "But Aunt Eleanor said, she told me the friend had moved to Florida, that they exchanged letters but couldn't visit anymore. She never mentioned anything about someone disappearing." The two women stood in the church parking lot, surrounded by the ordinary sounds of a community gathering after a funeral, while holding between them a piece of evidence that suggested Eleanor Vasquez had known more about Margaret Holloway's disappearance than she'd ever revealed. The hymnal was more than just a book. It was proof that Margaret had somehow, impossibly, been connected to Eleanor long after the morning she'd vanished on her way to church. Detective Lisa Park reopened Margaret Holloway's case file with hands that hadn't trembled in years of police work. But the burgundy hymnal sitting on her desk seemed to pulse with significance that made her question everything she thought she knew about unsolved cases. The book looked innocuous enough. Worn leather cover, gold lettering faded with age, pages soft from decades of use. But it represented the first real evidence in a case that had gone cold so completely that Park had begun to think it would never be solved. The handwriting analysis took 3 days, conducted by the State Crime Lab with the thoroughness reserved for cases that might finally see resolution. The results confirmed what Sarah already knew in her heart. This was definitely Margaret's hymnal, bearing not only her familiar annotations from decades of church attendance, but also newer entries that seemed to document years of life lived in secret. The latest entry was dated just 6 months before Eleanor's death. A note beside "Blessed Assurance" that read, "Eleanor's favorite." She hummed this while gardening, especially when the roses were blooming. The handwriting was Margaret's, but slightly shakier than her earlier annotations, suggesting the natural changes that come with advanced age. The implications were staggering. Margaret Holloway had been alive, and apparently in contact with Eleanor Vasquez, for years after her disappearance. Patricia Vasquez Chen was interviewed extensively, her initial shock giving way to a growing understanding of how thoroughly she'd been deceived by her great-aunt. Patricia had visited Eleanor regularly in the final years of her life, especially after Eleanor's dementia diagnosis in 2018, but she'd never seen any evidence of another person living on the property or even visiting regularly. Aunt Eleanor was very private about her personal life, Patricia told Detective Park during their third interview. She never talked much about her friends, and I assumed that was just her personality. When she mentioned the friend who'd given her the hymnal, I thought it was sweet that she had such fond memories of their friendship. The investigation focused on Eleanor's property, a modest house on 3 acres at the edge of Millbrook, about 4 miles from where Margaret had last been seen. Eleanor had lived alone since her husband's death in 2008, maintaining an extensive garden that had been her pride and joy. The property was isolated enough to provide privacy, surrounded by woods on 3 sides, and accessible by a long driveway that couldn't be seen from the main road. When police obtained a warrant to search Eleanor's property, they found something that changed everything: a small, well-maintained cottage in the back corner of the garden, hidden behind a grove of apple trees that Eleanor had planted decades earlier. The cottage had been invisible from the road and from Eleanor's main house, tucked away like a secret that had been carefully guarded for 14 years. The cottage was small but comfortable, clearly designed as a guest house or retreat. It had electricity and running water, a tiny kitchen, a sitting area with built-in bookshelves, and a bedroom just large enough for a single bed and dresser. Everything was clean and well-maintained, suggesting recent occupancy, but the cottage was empty when police arrived. Inside, they found evidence of a life lived in hiding. Women's clothing in Margaret's size hung in the small closet. Simple dresses and sweaters, the kind of practical garments Margaret had always favored. Prescription bottles with Margaret's name lined the bathroom medicine cabinet, filled as recently as 2022 by a pharmacy in the next county. The medications were for her arthritis and blood pressure, the same conditions she'd been treating when she disappeared. The kitchen showed signs of recent use: clean dishes in the drainer, food in the refrigerator that hadn't yet expired, a coffee maker that still held the faint aroma of morning brew. On the small dining table sat a stack of library books, all checked out under Eleanor's name, but clearly chosen for someone with Margaret's tastes: cozy mysteries, historical fiction, and a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. But it was the bedroom that provided the most poignant evidence of Margaret's hidden life. On the bedside table sat a framed photograph of Margaret and Eleanor from their church volunteer days, both women smiling at the camera with the easy affection of close friends. Next to it was a small journal, its pages filled with Margaret's handwriting, documenting a life lived in secret. The journal entries painted a picture of contentment mixed with profound sadness. Margaret wrote about the changing seasons in Eleanor's garden, about the books she'd been reading, about the birds that visited the feeder outside her window. But she also wrote about missing her children, about the pain of watching them grieve for her while being unable to comfort them, about the impossible choice she'd made, and the reasons that had driven her to it. Eleanor says Sarah looks tired when she visits the house, read one entry from 2015. I want so badly to go to her, to tell her I'm safe, but I can't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The price of my freedom is their pain, and some days I'm not sure it's worth it. Detective Park read through the journal with growing amazement and horror, piecing together a story that was both heartbreaking and deeply disturbing. Margaret hadn't been kidnapped or murdered. She had chosen to disappear, but the reasons for that choice were buried in secrets that Eleanor had taken to her grave. The journal revealed that Margaret had been living in the cottage since shortly after her disappearance, cared for by Eleanor in a conspiracy of silence that had lasted 14 years. But Margaret wasn't there now, and the journal's final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Eleanor's death, suggested that Margaret had known her friend was dying and had made plans for what would happen next. Eleanor is getting worse, the final entry read. She forgets things now, important things. Yesterday she called me by her sister's name, and for a moment she didn't remember why I was here. I think it's time for me to go. I can't risk her saying something in confusion. Can't let this secret destroy her memory or hurt the children any more than it already has. But where had Margaret gone? And why had she chosen to disappear in the first place? The cottage held clues but no definitive answers, evidence of a hidden life, but not the reasons that had made such a life necessary. The truth emerged slowly, pieced together from Eleanor's medical records, bank statements, and the testimony of her home health aide, Maria Santos, who had been caring for Eleanor during her final years. Maria had noticed things, small inconsistencies, unexplained details, that she'd dismissed at the time but now recognized as evidence of Eleanor's carefully guarded secret. Mrs. Vasquez always insisted on doing her own grocery shopping, even when it became difficult for her, Maria told Detective Park. She said she enjoyed getting out, but she always bought twice as much food as one person could eat. When I asked about it, she said she liked to be prepared for unexpected guests. Eleanor's bank records revealed regular cash withdrawals that were larger than her modest lifestyle would suggest, along with payments to a pharmacy in the next county for prescriptions that weren't in her name. There were also payments to a private medical practice that specialized in treating patients who preferred to remain anonymous, a service that catered to people who couldn't or wouldn't use traditional healthcare systems. The medical practice, when contacted by police, confirmed that they had been treating a patient under Eleanor's insurance for over a decade, someone who matched Margaret's description and medical history. The patient had been seen regularly for routine care, always paying in cash, and always accompanied by Eleanor, who claimed to be caring for a relative who preferred privacy due to family complications. But the most revealing evidence came from Eleanor's own words, recorded in a series of audio diaries she'd made during her battle with dementia. Eleanor had been a meticulous record keeper all her life, and as her memory began to fail, she'd started recording daily summaries to help her remember important information. The recordings, found in a shoebox in her bedroom closet, contained the full story of Margaret's disappearance and the 14 years that followed. Eleanor's voice, growing progressively more frail and confused over the months of recordings, told a story that was both shocking and heartbreaking. Margaret hadn't disappeared voluntarily. She had been fleeing from a threat that she'd kept hidden from everyone, including her own children. Margaret came to me that Sunday morning, Eleanor's voice whispered from the small digital recorder. She was terrified, shaking like a leaf. She said he'd found her, that he was coming for her, that she had to disappear or he'd hurt the children. I didn't understand at first. Margaret had always seemed so safe, so protected. But then she showed me the letters. The letters Eleanor referenced were found hidden in the cottage, tucked inside a hollowed-out book on the shelf. They were written in a cramped, angry handwriting that grew increasingly threatening over time. The letters were signed, "Your loving brother, Thomas," and they told a story of obsession, mental illness, and escalating threats that Margaret had endured in silence for months before her disappearance. Thomas Turner was Margaret's younger brother, a man who'd struggled with mental illness and substance abuse for most of his adult life. Margaret had helped support him financially for years, sending money when he was unemployed, paying for treatment programs when he was ready to get clean, always hoping that her love and assistance would help him find stability. But Thomas's mental state had deteriorated in the months before Margaret's disappearance. His letters revealed a growing paranoia and an unhealthy fixation on his sister, whom he blamed for various failures in his life. He'd convinced himself that Margaret owed him money, a substantial inheritance he believed their parents had left to her, instead of dividing equally. The letters showed his increasing anger and his threats to make her pay for what he saw as her betrayal of family loyalty. He said he was coming to Millbrook, Eleanor's recorded voice continued. He said he knew where she lived, knew her routine, knew she walked to church every Sunday. He said he was going to make her give him what was rightfully his, and if she refused, he'd hurt her children to make her understand how serious he was. Margaret had received the final letter on Saturday, the day before her disappearance. In it, Thomas had written that he was already in town, that he was watching her house, that Sunday would be the day of reckoning. Terrified for her children's safety, and knowing that Thomas was unstable enough to carry out his threats, Margaret had made the desperate decision to disappear, hoping that if she vanished, Thomas would have no reason to hurt her family. She'd left her house that Sunday morning as usual, but instead of walking to church, she'd gone to Eleanor's house, arriving in a state of panic and begging for help. Eleanor, who'd known about Thomas's problems but not the extent of his threats, had immediately agreed to hide Margaret until they could figure out what to do. "We thought it would be temporary," Eleanor's voice explained. "Just until Thomas gave up and went away, until we could get help from the police. But Margaret was so afraid, so convinced that he'd hurt Sarah or the boys if he couldn't find her. And then when the search started, when we saw how much pain her disappearance was causing, We didn't know how to undo what we'd done. The cottage had been built as a temporary hiding place, but temporary had stretched into months, then years. Thomas had indeed come to Millbrook, had watched Margaret's house, had even approached her children asking about her whereabouts. But when it became clear that Margaret had truly vanished, he'd eventually given up and left town, returning to his transient lifestyle in other states. Margaret had wanted to return to her family once Thomas was gone, but the longer she stayed hidden, the harder it became to explain her absence. How could she tell her children that she'd let them grieve for her, let them suffer the pain of her loss, because she'd been too afraid to trust them with the truth? How could she explain that she'd chosen to protect them by breaking their hearts? Eleanor's recordings revealed the depth of Margaret's anguish over the choice she'd made. "She cries sometimes," Eleanor had whispered into the recorder. "She watches the house from the woods, sees Sarah coming and going, sees her children visiting. She knows they're in pain and it's killing her, but she doesn't know how to come back from the dead without destroying them all over again." The final recordings, made just weeks before Eleanor's death, revealed that Margaret had finally decided to leave Millbrook permanently. Eleanor's dementia was worsening, and Margaret feared that her friend might accidentally reveal the secret in a moment of confusion. Rather than risk exposure that would hurt both Eleanor and her own family, Margaret had chosen to disappear again, this time forever. "She's going to California," Eleanor's final recording revealed. "She has a little money saved, and she thinks she can start over there, maybe find work caring for elderly people who need help. She says it's better this way, better for everyone if Margaret Holloway stays dead and buried. But I know it's breaking her heart to leave, just like it broke her heart to stay." Detective Park closed the Margaret Holloway case file for the final time on a gray November morning, 14 years and 1 month after an elderly woman had walked out of her house carrying a hymnal and disappeared into a mystery that had haunted an entire community. The resolution brought no satisfaction, only the bitter understanding that some truths are more painful than the mysteries they replace. Margaret Holloway was alive, or had been alive as recently as 6 months ago, but she was as lost to her family as if she had died that Sunday morning in 2009. The cottage in Eleanor's garden stood empty, cleaned out with the same meticulous care Margaret had once applied to her own home. She had vanished again, this time with the skill of someone who'd spent 14 years learning how to disappear. The investigation had traced her as far as a bus station in Portland, where security cameras showed a woman matching Margaret's description, purchasing a ticket to Los Angeles with cash. After that, the trail went cold. Margaret had become what she'd never intended to be, a ghost haunting the edges of other people's lives, a woman who'd sacrificed her own identity to protect the people she loved most. Sarah sat in her mother's kitchen for the last time, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that had been interrupted, but not ended. The house would finally be sold. There was no point in maintaining a shrine to someone who'd chosen to stay dead. But the knowledge of her mother's survival brought no comfort, only a different kind of grief that was somehow worse than the original loss. She was alive all this time, Sarah whispered to her brothers, who'd flown in to help pack their mother's belongings. She was 4 miles away, and she was alive, and she let us think she was dead. She let us grieve for her, let us blame ourselves, let us wonder if we could have done something different. David, now 53 and graying at the temples, held his sister as she cried tears that were somehow more bitter than those she'd shed for 14 years. "She thought she was protecting us," he said, but his voice carried no conviction. "She was afraid of Uncle Thomas, afraid he'd hurt us if he couldn't find her." Michael, the youngest at 49, stared out the kitchen window at the garden where Margaret had once tended her roses with such care. "Thomas died 3 years ago," he said quietly. "I found his obituary online. Liver failure, alone in a homeless shelter in Phoenix. She could have come home 3 years ago. She could have come home any time after the first year, when it was clear he'd given up looking for her." The truth was that Margaret's disappearance had become its own prison, a choice that had seemed temporary but had hardened into permanence through fear, shame, and the terrible weight of time. The longer she'd stayed hidden, the harder it had become to explain her absence, until the lie of her death had become easier to maintain than the truth of her survival. Thomas Turner's story emerged through police records and social services files. A man whose mental illness had been compounded by addiction and homelessness, whose threats had been real, but whose ability to carry them out had been limited by his own dysfunction. He'd spent most of the years after Margaret's disappearance in and out of treatment facilities, jails, and homeless shelters, a broken man whose obsession with his sister had faded as his mind deteriorated further. Margaret had sacrificed 14 years of her life and her family's peace of mind to escape a threat that had been more imagined than real. But Detective Park understood that fear doesn't always correspond to actual danger, that a woman who'd lived a sheltered life might reasonably be terrified by threats from a mentally ill brother, especially when those threats targeted her children. The hymnal was returned to Sarah, who held it like a relic of a faith that had been shattered by revelation. The annotations told the story of two lives: Margaret's public life of faith and community service, and her hidden life of exile and regret. The newer entries revealed a woman who'd found some measure of peace in Eleanor's garden, but who'd never stopped mourning the life she'd abandoned. "I understand why she did it," Sarah told Detective Park during their final interview. "I understand that she was afraid, that she thought she was protecting us, but I can't forgive her for staying hidden once the danger was past. I can't forgive her for letting us suffer when she could have ended our pain with a phone call." The case was officially closed as a voluntary missing person, resolved but not solved in any meaningful way. Margaret Holloway had exercised her right to disappear, to abandon her identity and start over somewhere else. The law couldn't compel her to return to a family she'd chosen to leave, couldn't force her to explain choices that had caused immeasurable pain to people who'd loved her unconditionally. St. Andrew's Methodist Church held a memorial service for Eleanor Vasquez that became, in many ways, a second funeral for Margaret Holloway. Pastor Martinez spoke about the complexity of love, about the ways people sometimes hurt those they're trying to protect, about the difference between understanding someone's choices and forgiving them. The third pew remained empty during the service, a space that would never again be filled by the woman who'd occupied it faithfully for 42 years. But the hymnal was there, placed on the seat like a bookmark in a story that would never have a proper ending. Sarah sang Amazing Grace with tears streaming down her face, her voice carrying the melody her mother had once supported with such strength. The words spoke of being lost and found, but Margaret Holloway remained lost in ways that had nothing to do with physical location, and everything to do with the choices that had severed her from the life she'd built and the people who'd loved her. After the service, Sarah drove past Eleanor's property one last time, looking toward the woods where the cottage stood empty, somewhere in California, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. A 77-year-old woman was living under a different name, carrying the weight of a decision that had saved her from one kind of death, but condemned her to another. The hymnal sat on Sarah's passenger seat, its burgundy cover worn smooth by decades of faithful hands. Inside, Margaret's annotations told the story of a life of faith, but they also documented the moment when that faith had been tested beyond its limits, when fear had proven stronger than love, when the desire to protect had become the instrument of destruction. Margaret Holloway had disappeared twice, once from a sidewalk on a Sunday morning, and once from the cottage where she'd hidden for 14 years. Both disappearances had been acts of love in their way, but love that had been twisted by fear into something that caused more pain than it prevented. The case was closed, but the questions it raised would linger forever. How well do we really know the people we love? What would we sacrifice to protect them? And when does protection become abandonment, love become cruelty, and the desire to save someone become the very thing that destroys them? In the end, Margaret Holloway's hymnal had returned to tell a story no one wanted to hear, that sometimes the people we mourn are not dead, but simply gone, not taken from us, but choosing to leave, not victims of tragedy, but architects of their own disappearance. It was a truth more devastating than any mystery, a resolution that resolved nothing and left everyone involved wishing the case had remained forever unsolved.